December 18, 1972. Hanoi. The air raid sirens wailed across the capital like the voice of something ancient and furious. Above the city, the night sky pulsed with searchlight beams cutting through monsoon clouds, sweeping back and forth in desperate arcs. Anti-aircraft guns roared from rooftops and rice paddies, their tracers climbing into the darkness like strings of angry fireflies. And somewhere high above it all, beyond the reach of those lights, beyond the ceiling of flak and fire, came the sound. Low. Distant. A rumble that seemed to shake the earth itself before you ever saw what caused it. The B-52s were coming. Inside a fortified bunker on the outskirts of Hanoi, a group of Soviet military advisors stood shoulder to shoulder with their North Vietnamese counterparts, staring at a wall of radar screens. Green phosphorescent lines swept across black glass, painting ghostly blips that appeared, multiplied, vanished, and reappeared in patterns that made no sense. One Soviet officer, a colonel whose name would later be redacted from every document, leaned closer to the console. His hand hovered over the communications switch. His jaw tightened. He had been in this war for 8 months. He had trained the Vietnamese crews himself. He had overseen the installation of the SA-2 guideline missile batteries that ringed the city like a steel noose. He had written reports assuring Moscow that American air power could be broken. Now, watching the chaos unfold on those screens, he understood something terrible. The Americans weren't just coming. They were already inside the system. And his missiles were flying blind. This is the story of the night the Soviet Union realized it had underestimated the United States. Not in firepower, not in numbers, but in something far more dangerous. The ability to turn an enemy's strength into weakness, to weaponize technology itself, and to rewrite the rules of war faster than anyone could keep up. It's a story buried in declassified reports, whispered among veterans, and hidden in the static between radar pulses over Hanoi. It's the story of the moment Soviet confidence shattered against American ingenuity and changed the course of the Cold War forever. To understand that night, you have to go back to the beginning. Back to when the Soviets believed they had already won. By 1972, North Vietnam had become the most heavily defended piece of airspace on the planet. The Soviet Union had poured resources into the country for nearly a decade, transforming Hanoi and the surrounding regions into a fortress bristling with surface-to-air missile sites, radar installations, and anti-aircraft artillery. At the heart of this defense network sat the SA-2 guideline, a radar-guided missile system that had already proven itself capable of bringing down high-altitude aircraft. In 1960, an SA-2 had shot down Francis Gary Powers' U-2 spy plane over the Soviet Union, a propaganda victory that sent shockwaves through Washington and convinced Moscow that they had achieved parity, perhaps even superiority, in air defense technology. The SA-2 was a beast. Standing over 30 feet tall, weighing nearly 5,000 pounds, it could reach altitudes of 80,000 feet and speeds exceeding Mach 3. Its radar guidance system, the Fansong, could track targets from dozens of miles away and guide the missile to within lethal range with terrifying precision. For the Soviets, it represented the pinnacle of socialist engineering, proof that collective scientific effort could match, even surpass, the capitalist West. Soviet military advisors arrived in North Vietnam by the hundreds. They trained Vietnamese crews, installed equipment, and coordinated defense strategies. Many of them were veterans, men who had fought in the Great Patriotic War, who understood the value of layered defenses and integrated systems. They approached the air war over Vietnam with methodical confidence. The Americans, they believed, would rely on brute force. Heavy bombers flying predictable patterns. Fighters making obvious approaches. It would be, they thought, a matter of patience and discipline. Let the Americans come. Let them throw their machines into the fire. The missiles would do the rest. In Moscow, reports flowed in describing early successes. American aircraft were being shot down. Pilots were ejecting over hostile territory or limping back to carriers with shredded fuselages. The North Vietnamese celebrated each kill, and the Soviets documented every one, analyzing wreckage, interviewing captured pilots, refining tactics. There was a sense, in those early years, that the tide was turning. That air power, the great American advantage, could be neutralized by technology and will. The early victories bred confidence that bordered on complacency. Soviet advisors watched as SA-2 batteries destroyed F-105 Thunderchiefs, F-4 Phantoms, and even the occasional A-6 intruder. Each successful intercept validated their doctrine, reinforced their training methods, and justified the massive investment in air defense technology. The North Vietnamese crews grew skilled under Soviet tutelarship, learning to operate the complex radar systems, coordinate battery fire, and maintain the temperamental missiles in tropical humidity that corroded metal and degraded electronics. But the Americans were learning too. And they were learning faster. The United States Air Force and Navy had begun the war with aircraft designed for a different kind of conflict. Jets built for nuclear deterrence and high-altitude interception suddenly found themselves dodging missiles in the jungles of Southeast Asia. Losses mounted. Tactics that worked in training proved suicidal in combat. The SA-2 sites were mobile, well hidden, and defended by overlapping fields of fire. American pilots called the skies over Hanoi the most dangerous place on Earth. Some refused to fly there. Others flew and never returned. The early years of Rolling Thunder were brutal. American formations would approach their targets in predictable patterns, following doctrine written for a war that no longer existed. Soviet radar operators could track them from miles away, vectoring missile batteries onto intercept courses with mechanical precision. The SA-2 had a kill radius large enough that near misses were often fatal. Pilots who survived described the missiles as telephone poles trailing fire, climbing through the sky with impossible speed and maneuverability. Then something changed. The Americans stopped trying to fly around the defenses. They started flying through them. And they brought weapons the Soviets hadn't imagined. Operation Rolling Thunder had been a grinding, years-long campaign of airstrikes that achieved little and cost much. By 1972, with negotiations stalled and North Vietnamese forces pushing south, President Nixon authorized a new strategy. Operation Linebacker I began in May, followed by the even more intense Linebacker II in December. This wasn't the cautious, incremental bombing of the past. This was total war from the sky. Hundreds of B-52 Stratofortresses, massive 8-engine bombers that had been designed to carry nuclear weapons deep into Soviet territory, were now unleashed over North Vietnam in wave after wave of concentrated strikes. They were escorted by F-4 Phantoms, supported by F-105G Wild Weasels, and protected by EB-66 electronic warfare aircraft that turned the electromagnetic spectrum into a battlefield all its own. The Soviets had never seen anything like it. Not in scale, not in coordination, and certainly not in the technology that made it possible. The Wild Weasels were the key. These were F-105 Thunderchiefs modified to hunt surface-to-air missile sites by doing something that seemed insane, flying directly toward them. When a fan-song radar locked onto an aircraft, the Wild Weasel crew didn't evade. They turned toward the signal, locked onto the radar emission itself, and fired an anti-radiation missile, the AGM-45 Shrike or the more advanced AGM-78 Standard, that would ride the radar beam straight back to its source. The missile crews on the ground faced an impossible choice: keep the radar on and guide the SA-2 to its target, or shut down and go blind to save themselves. Either way, the Americans won. The Wild Weasel crews developed a reputation that bordered on mythical. They were volunteers, men who understood that their survival depended on aggression, on flying toward the most dangerous targets while everyone else was flying away. Their motto was simple and brutal: "You gotta be shitting me." It was supposedly the first thing a Wild Weasel pilot said when briefed on the mission profile. The crews consisted of a pilot and an electronic warfare officer, working in tandem to detect, identify, and destroy enemy radar sites. The EWO would monitor a panel of equipment that could detect radar emissions across multiple frequencies, calling out threats while the pilot maneuvered the aircraft into attack position. Soviet advisors watched in mounting horror as their carefully constructed defense network began to collapse under the weight of American countermeasures. The electronic warfare aircraft pumped the air full of jamming signals, false targets, and radar noise that turned their scopes into meaningless static. B-52 formations flew in tight patterns designed to overlap their jamming pods, creating bubbles of electromagnetic chaos that swallowed radar pulses whole. Decoy flares tumbled through the night sky, blooming white-hot and pulling heat-seeking missiles away from their targets. American pilots changed altitudes and headings mid-flight with a coordination that suggested real-time communication networks the Soviets didn't know existed. The jamming was unlike anything Soviet engineers had anticipated. American electronic warfare systems could identify the frequency of an enemy radar, analyze its characteristics in microseconds, and generate interference tailored specifically to that system. The Fansong radar, which had seemed so sophisticated just years earlier, suddenly appeared primitive. Its signals were predictable, its frequency range limited, its resistance to jamming almost non-existent. Soviet advisors sent urgent requests back to Moscow for updated equipment, for new countermeasures, for anything that might restore the advantage. But equipment took months to manufacture and ship, and the Americans were adapting their tactics nightly. And then there was the night of December 20th. A massive formation of B-52s approached Hanoi from multiple directions simultaneously. The Soviet advisors in the command bunker watched the radar screens light up with contacts. Dozens of them. Too many to count. The Fansong operators began locking onto targets, calling out ranges and bearings. Missile batteries across the city roared to life, launching SA-2s into the sky in a coordinated volley that should have turned the American formation into falling wreckage. The missiles climbed. The radar guided them. And then, one by one, they lost lock. The Soviet colonel watched as his screens filled with ghost images. Targets multiplied, split, vanished. The missiles continued upward, chasing phantoms, detonating harmlessly in empty air. A few found their marks. The SA-2 was still deadly when it connected, but the hit rate was catastrophic. Out of dozens of missiles fired, only a handful struck home. The rest spiraled off into the night or exploded prematurely, their proximity fuses triggered by American chaff clouds that turned the sky into a blizzard of metallic confetti. The chaff was ingenious in its simplicity. Bundles of aluminum strips, cut to precise lengths to match radar wavelengths, would burst from dispensers and create massive clouds of false returns. On radar screens, a single aircraft could appear as dozens. A formation of bombers could look like a swarm of hundreds. And because the chaff drifted slowly on the wind, it created a fog that persisted long after the aircraft had passed, masking their true positions and making accurate targeting nearly impossible. Above the city, the B-52s continued their run. Bombay doors opened, and Hanoi burned. In the aftermath, the bunker fell into stunned silence. Vietnamese crews shouted reports, trying to make sense of what had happened. Soviet advisors exchanged glances, their expressions tight with disbelief. One officer, a radar specialist who had helped install the Fansong systems, sat down heavily and put his head in his hands. He had spent years mastering this technology. He had trained others. He had believed in it. And in a single night, it had been rendered almost useless. The reports sent back to Moscow were blunt. The Americans had achieved electronic warfare capabilities that were 5, perhaps 10 years ahead of Soviet development. Their jamming was sophisticated, adaptive, and overwhelming. Their anti-radiation missiles were faster and more accurate than anything the Soviets had anticipated. And their coordination, the way aircraft, satellites, and ground controllers worked together in real time, suggested an integrated command and control network that Soviet forces couldn't match. One report, declassified decades later, contained a line that became infamous among military historians. Their electronic warfare made our missiles blind. We underestimated the Americans' countermeasure technology. Another Soviet advisor, writing in his personal notes, was even more direct. They didn't just beat our systems. They made us afraid to turn them on. This was the nightmare scenario. A defense network that couldn't defend. Missiles that couldn't hit. Radar that couldn't see. The Americans had done what the Soviets thought impossible. They had turned superior numbers and defensive positioning into liabilities. Every missile site that activated its radar became a target. Every SA-2 launched was a gamble that it might actually reach its target before jamming pulled it off course. The doctrine of layered air defense, the strategy that had dominated Soviet military thinking since World War II, had been dismantled by technology and tactics that evolved faster than countermeasures could be deployed. But it wasn't just technology. The Soviet advisors recognized something else in those December raids. Something harder to quantify but impossible to ignore. The American pilots were good. Not just skilled. Not just brave. They were operating at a level of tactical sophistication that came from constant adaptation, aggressive innovation, and a command structure that empowered individual units to make split-second decisions. Soviet doctrine emphasized central control and rigid planning. The Americans seemed to thrive on chaos, turning unpredictability into an advantage. The Wild Weasel crews, in particular, earned a grudging respect. These men flew the most dangerous missions of the war, deliberately drawing fire to expose enemy positions. They called themselves the first in, last out, the first aircraft into a target area and the last to leave, staying behind to suppress defenses while bombers completed their runs. Soviet officers studying the wreckage of destroyed radar sites began to understand that they weren't just fighting machines. They were fighting a mindset, an approach to warfare that valued flexibility over rigidity, innovation over doctrine, and speed over caution. Operation Linebacker 2 lasted 11 days. In that time, American forces flew over 700 B-52 sorties, dropped more than 15,000 tons of ordnance, and lost 15 B-52s to all causes, a loss rate of roughly 2%. By the standards of strategic bombing, especially against one of the most heavily defended targets in history, it was an astonishing success. The North Vietnamese infrastructure around Hanoi was devastated. Rail yards, supply depots, and military installations were reduced to rubble. And the Soviet Union learned a lesson it would spend the next decade trying to absorb. The statistics told only part of the story. Behind the numbers were individual missions that demonstrated American tactical sophistication in ways that Soviet observers found both impressive and troubling. B-52 formations would approach from different altitudes and directions, forcing defenders to split their attention. Electronic warfare aircraft would saturate specific radar frequencies while bombers exploited the gaps. Wild Weasel teams would hunt the most dangerous sites first, clearing corridors for the heavy bombers that followed. The immediate impact was doctrinal. Moscow initiated a crash program to develop next-generation surface-to-air missile systems with better resistance to jamming and faster response times. The SA-10 Grumble, which would eventually enter service in the late 1970s, incorporated lessons learned directly from Hanoi. Soviet engineers worked to create radar systems with frequency-hopping capabilities, making them harder to jam. They developed missiles with better proximity fuses and improved guidance algorithms. They studied captured American electronic warfare pods and reverse-engineered what they could. But there was a deeper, more unsettling realization that couldn't be fixed with new hardware. The Americans had demonstrated an ability to innovate in real time, to adapt their tactics and technology faster than the Soviets could respond. This wasn't a gap that could be closed with a single weapon system. It was a systemic difference in how the two superpowers approached the problem of warfare. Soviet military development was centralized, methodical, and slow. American development was decentralized, competitive, and fast. Companies competed for contracts. Pilots fed tactical observations directly to engineers. New systems were tested in combat and modified on the fly. The Soviets had built a fortress. The Americans had built an ecosystem. For the aircrews who flew those missions, the memory remained vivid for the rest of their lives. B-52 pilots recalled the sensation of flying through walls of flak, feeling the aircraft shudder as shrapnel peppered the fuselage, watching SA-2 streak past the cockpit windows like meteors. Electronic warfare officers described the strange, tense focus of watching their jamming equipment work, knowing that if it failed, if the systems didn't perform exactly as designed, they would die in the next 30 seconds. Wild Weasel crews spoke of the adrenaline, the fear, and the grim satisfaction of watching a radar site go dark after a successful strike. Years later, some of those veterans encountered Soviet officers at military conferences and air shows. The conversations were awkward, polite, and sometimes surprisingly candid. One American pilot recalled a Soviet advisor telling him, with a kind of weary respect, "After Hanoi, we stopped underestimating you." It was as close to an admission as anyone would get. The Soviet military didn't publicize its failures. But within the closed circles of defense planners and intelligence analysts, the reports from Vietnam became required reading. The legacy of those nights over Hanoi extended far beyond the immediate tactical outcomes. For the United States, Operation Linebacker II validated a decade of investment in electronic warfare, precision guidance, and integrated air operations. It proved that technology, when properly applied and constantly refined, could overcome numerical and geographical disadvantages. It gave American air power a psychological edge that would persist through the Cold War and into the conflicts that followed. The Gulf War, with its overwhelming air campaign and minimal losses, was built on lessons learned in the skies over North Vietnam. For the Soviet Union, the experience became a cautionary tale about the dangers of complacency. The SA-2 had been a revolutionary system when it was introduced. But technology doesn't stand still, and an advantage that isn't constantly updated becomes a vulnerability. The Americans had understood this. They had built systems designed to be upgraded, modified, and replaced. Soviet systems, by contrast, were often treated as finished products, deployed and left in place until they became obsolete. There was also a human element that Soviet reports struggled to articulate, an intangible factor that slipped through the precision of charts and tables. Behind every missile fired and every aircraft lost was a psychology that defied quantification. American pilots spoke about their missions with an aggressive confidence that, to Soviet ears, sounded like arrogance. Yet that arrogance was not hollow, it was conviction, sharpened by training and reinforced by a culture that celebrated initiative. They believed, both individually and collectively, that they could win. That belief wasn't just motivational, it was tactical. When you think about the skies over Vietnam in the early 1970s, you have to imagine two entirely different worlds colliding. On one side, the Soviet-designed air defense network, rigid, hierarchical, methodical. On the other, the American air campaign, decentralized, improvisational, fluid. The Americans weren't just flying, they were experimenting in real time. Each mission was a laboratory of adaptation. Each failure was a lesson. Soviet advisors who witnessed this could hardly describe it without resorting to language that broke with their training. "They do not fight as we do," one of them wrote. "They act first, analyze later, and somehow it works." American doctrine taught pilots to think, not just obey. Every man in the cockpit had authority to adapt the plan. When the unexpected happened, and it always did, they could decide in seconds. Their philosophy valued improvisation, because the Americans understood that in combat, uncertainty wasn't the exception, it was the rule. Soviet doctrine, by contrast, treated deviation as disorder. In Soviet manuals, the ideal officer executed the plan flawlessly, without question. Orders were sacred, structure was safety. The contrast couldn't have been starker. The Soviets viewed the battlefield as a chessboard, every move prearranged, every counter anticipated. The Americans viewed it as a storm. You couldn't control it, only navigate it. And in that chaos, their adaptability became their greatest weapon. The result was not always elegant, but it was effective. Where the Soviets saw chaos, the Americans saw opportunity. In the chaos of modern air warfare, radar interference, electronic deception, missiles that could think faster than humans, the side that could learn in real time held the advantage. That was the lesson the Soviet Union struggled to face. Declassified Soviet documents from that period, written in dense, bureaucratic language, tell a story far more human than their authors intended. They reveal a system beginning to doubt itself. Soviet advisors returned from Vietnam not just with tactical data, but with quiet disillusionment. They brought home detailed logs, radar graphs, and eyewitness accounts of American air raids that seemed to defy explanation. They documented missile failure rates, jamming intensities, radar interference patterns, but buried between the numbers was something far more troubling, an acknowledgement that the Americans were evolving faster than the Soviet system could comprehend. The reports were written with characteristic precision. They noted improvements in U.S. strike coordination, new electronic warfare strategies, and increasingly unpredictable bombing patterns. Each report ended with recommendations for reform, some practical, some desperate. Improvement of pilot autonomy, one memo suggested. Flexible counter-jamming procedures. Another proposed restructuring command hierarchies to allow for faster decision cycles. Some of these ideas were quietly tested. Most were buried. For the men writing these reports, the process was exhausting. They were watching the rules of war change in front of them, yet they had to translate that chaos into language their superiors would accept. The Americans have changed the character of air operations, one Soviet advisor lamented. Our understanding lags behind reality. That gap between understanding and reality became a chasm. Among the thousands of documents that trickled back to Moscow, one stands out, a memo written in 1973 by a senior Soviet air defense officer who had seen the American air campaign firsthand. It was blunt, almost painfully so. The Americans have demonstrated mastery of large-scale electronic warfare. Their integration of jamming, anti-radiation missiles, and coordinated strike packages represents a doctrinal leap we did not anticipate. Our current systems are inadequate against this level of sophistication. Urgent modernization is required, not just of hardware, but of training, tactics, and operational philosophy. That last phrase, operational philosophy, was explosive. It implied that the problem wasn't just technical, but fundamental. It wasn't the missiles or the radars that had failed, it was the mindset that guided their use. The officer was not just questioning the tools of Soviet warfare, but its very logic. Within the upper ranks of the Soviet military, that memo spread like a shockwave. Some read it with alarm, others with hostility. To question operational philosophy was to question Marxist-Leninist certainty itself, the idea that centralized control and disciplined execution would always triumph over capitalist chaos. The idea that the American success stemmed from disorder bordered on blasphemy. A few brave officers agreed with the memo's author, quietly acknowledging that the Americans' chaotic methods might conceal a deeper structure, one designed for learning, not conformity. But most dismissed it as defeatist. They win because they can afford to lose, one general scoffed during a closed briefing. Their waste is their strength. It is not a model for us. Yet even those who denied the memo's implications could not ignore the results. For every theoretical rebuttal, there was an undeniable fact: the Americans were adapting faster. Their losses decreased. Their precision improved. Their coordination grew seamless. Soviet analysts noted, sometimes with admiration, sometimes with resentment, that American pilots seemed to treat warfare like a living organism, something that learned, evolved, and responded. For the Soviet Union, built on predictability and control, this was unthinkable. The author of the 1973 memo was quietly reassigned. His career never recovered, though his ideas lived on in whispers among younger officers who understood what he had tried to say. Years later, during the Soviet-Afghan War, fragments of his language resurfaced in internal training documents. Operational flexibility, they called it, a euphemism for what he had dared to call philosophy. The Americans, for their part, continued refining the art of adaptation. Their doctrine evolved not in libraries, but in after-action debriefings, hangars, and simulation rooms. Every mission generated feedback. Every error became instruction. They were building, perhaps without realizing it, a self-learning war machine. It was this cultural difference, the speed of learning, that most defined the contest between the two superpowers. The Soviets had systems. The Americans had evolution. Both had power. But one had momentum. By late 1972, the difference was visible even from orbit. U.S. satellites tracked Soviet air defenses with uncanny accuracy. American engineers developed countermeasures faster than Soviet technicians could update their systems. Each week, new frequencies, new radar signatures, new strike formations. The Soviets, bound by procedure, found themselves constantly one step behind. The climax of this invisible duel came in December 1972, during the campaign that would be remembered as Linebacker II, the Christmas bombings. For 11 nights, the skies above Hanoi became an inferno of technology and terror. The roar of engines filled the air as wave after wave of American bombers, B-52s, F-111s, and F-4 Phantoms, descended into one of the most heavily defended airspaces on Earth. From their bunkers, Soviet advisors watched radar screens flicker with life. Dozens of missile batteries tracked incoming formations. Every few seconds, another SAM streaked upward, carving white arcs into the black sky. For a moment, it seemed as though the defenders were holding. Several bombers were downed in the first nights. Soviet and North Vietnamese crews cheered, convinced the Americans had finally overreached. But the Americans were learning in real time. They changed flight altitudes. They altered timing. They adjusted formation spacing and jammer synchronization. Radar-guided missiles that had been deadly on the first night began missing on the third. The Americans were rewriting their playbook between sorties. Each adjustment was recorded, analyzed, and implemented by the next crew within hours. To the Soviets, this was incomprehensible. Their system required weeks, sometimes months, to modify doctrine. The Americans were doing it mid-battle. By the fifth night, Soviet officers began to see what was happening. Their radar screens told a different story: fewer locks, more false echoes, confusion in tracking systems. The Americans had turned the electromagnetic spectrum into a weapon. Their jammers created illusions of phantom bombers. Anti-radiation missiles targeted any radar foolish enough to stay active. Every move the defenders made seemed to trigger a faster, smarter response. Inside the Hanoi command centers, frustration gave way to disbelief. Soviet advisors filed frantic notes. "Our systems are being blinded," one wrote. "Countermeasures appear intelligent, adaptive, self-coordinating." It was as if the Americans had fused man and machine into one seamless force. By the final nights of the campaign, the balance had shifted entirely. The Americans no longer looked like intruders fighting through defenses. They looked like architects dismantling them. And when the raids ended and the silence returned to the skies, something else remained behind, a realization that would haunt the Soviet Union for years. They had not merely lost a battle of weapons. They had lost a battle of thinking. In the aftermath of those nights over Hanoi, the Soviet military found itself staring into a mirror it did not want to face. The losses of the North Vietnamese air defenses were not just tactical failures. They were philosophical ones. Every debriefing, every report, every intercepted radio log forced the same uncomfortable conclusion: the Americans had fought a different kind of war. And worse, they had fought it better. Back in Moscow, the first comprehensive post-mission assessments began circulating among senior officers. They were dry on the surface, page after page of diagrams, frequencies, missile trajectories, but between the lines, they told a story of astonishment. The Americans, one report noted, demonstrated integration between electronic and kinetic forces at a level not yet achievable in our doctrine. That word, integration, became the quiet obsession of an entire generation of Soviet planners. Integration meant synergy, the seamless cooperation of intelligence, technology, and human decision-making. The Americans didn't just jam radars. They used the data from those jamming signals to predict enemy behavior. Their aircraft communicated constantly, forming what the Soviets later called a networked battlespace. Soviet analysts could measure frequencies, but they couldn't quantify what they were truly seeing: the birth of an information-centric form of warfare. To the Soviet mind, it was chaos masquerading as genius. To the Americans, it was simply the next logical step. Even years later, veterans who had been stationed in Hanoi remembered those nights not for the explosions, but for the silence that followed them. The eerie quiet in the command rooms after the radar screens went blank. The look on the faces of the advisors who had believed their systems were impenetrable. They had been trained to think that technology, when perfected, would guarantee victory. But perfection, they realized too late, was a trap. The Americans hadn't sought perfection, they had sought momentum. And momentum was what the Soviet Union lacked. This realization rippled outward. Within months, a classified review was convened under the supervision of the Air Defense Command in Moscow. The tone was grim but candid. "We have failed to anticipate the full implications of electronic warfare," the report concluded. We underestimated the degree to which information dominance determines combat outcomes. It was the closest the Soviet system would ever come to admitting strategic inferiority. Yet even then, bureaucracy resisted change. Engineers called for modernization of radar systems, for better missile guidance, for wider frequency ranges. But few dared to touch the real issue, the human one. Soviet pilots and radar operators were still trained to obey first, to analyze later. To innovate was to risk punishment. And so, while the technology improved, the doctrine remained trapped in the past. Meanwhile, across the ocean, the U.S. Air Force was institutionalizing the very lessons that had shocked the Soviets. From the chaos of Vietnam emerged a new culture, one that turned adaptability into doctrine. Every sortie was dissected. Every loss became a case study. By the late 1970s, what had once been improvisation was now codified as a system. Flexible command structures, real-time data sharing, and a near-religious emphasis on feedback. The Americans had learned something profound about warfare. That innovation didn't come from technology alone. It came from the freedom to fail fast and learn faster. Inside the Kremlin's defense committees, that idea was heresy. How could a military built on discipline accept the idea that success came from disorder? And yet, privately, more and more officers began to admit what the data had already shown. "They learn faster than we do," one general said during a 1975 closed session. "They are allowed to be wrong. We are not." That single difference, freedom, became the defining variable in the technological rivalry that followed. Over the next decade, the Soviets poured resources into catching up. New generations of surface-to-air missiles were designed, radars hardened against jamming, aircraft upgraded with better avionics. But at every stage, they remained reactive. For every American innovation, the Soviets produced a countermeasure. For every countermeasure, the Americans found a workaround. The game of cat and mouse became the rhythm of the Cold War itself. The irony was painful. The Soviet Union had once led the world in theoretical physics, in rocketry, in mathematical precision. They understood systems better than anyone, but not systems that could change themselves. The Americans had discovered that adaptability, not control, was the true weapon of the modern age. By the late 1980s, as computers began to dominate command centers, the lesson of Hanoi had evolved into a principle that guided everything from flight training to satellite strategy. Whoever controls information controls the battlefield. That idea would go on to shape the Gulf War, stealth technology, and even the digital battlefields of the 21st century. But its roots were planted in those cold December nights over North Vietnam, when Soviet advisors realized, perhaps for the first time, that they were witnessing the future, and that the future did not belong to them. For the men who lived through it, the memory never faded. American pilots remembered the fear of flying through invisible walls of missile fire, trusting that their technology and teamwork would hold. They remembered the constant improvisation, the calls over the radio, the flickering screens, the sound of radar locks breaking just in time. They remembered losing friends, and realizing that survival depended not on being the best, but on adapting the fastest. Soviet advisors remembered something else, the silence in the aftermath. The disbelief. The sense that the very logic of their world had cracked. Many of them spent years afterward trying to explain what they'd seen in language their superiors would accept, but there were no words in Soviet military vocabulary for defeat by innovation. Some of those men retired quietly, others continued to serve, carrying the lesson with them like a secret they could never speak aloud. Decades later, when the Soviet Union finally collapsed, a few surviving officers would look back and say that the real fracture had not come from Afghanistan or from the arms race, but from something deeper, the realization that the system they had built could not learn fast enough to survive. The story of the Soviet advisors watching American jets over Hanoi is, in the end, not just about technology. It's about what happens when a belief system meets a new reality and fails to adapt. It's about the difference between control and creativity, between obedience and understanding. It's easy to focus on the hardware, the missiles, the aircraft, the radars, but the true battle was fought in the invisible space between recognition and response, between seeing a threat and understanding how to meet it before it changed again. The United States, for all its contradictions and missteps in Vietnam, had built a military infrastructure that rewarded learning. The Soviet Union, for all its order and discipline, had built one that punished it. Both models produced power. But only one could evolve. And that made all the difference. Those nights over Hanoi in December 1972 were not the end of the Cold War. But they marked the beginning of a transformation that would define the rest of it. They were the moment when the Soviet Union realized that American air power was not just a matter of quantity, but of quality, not just machinery, but mindset. They were the moment when confidence gave way to caution, when ideology collided with innovation, and when the balance of power in the skies shifted in a way that could never be undone. For the Americans, victory came not just from courage, but from the courage to change. For the Soviets, defeat came not from weakness, but from rigidity. And somewhere, deep in the archives, among the yellowing pages of classified reports and the faint smell of cold ink, lies the truth that both sides eventually understood, that modern war is not won by fortresses or firepower, but by those who can think faster than the enemy can react. The Soviets had built a wall of missiles around Hanoi. The Americans had learned to fly through it. And in doing so, they didn't just win the battle for the skies. They redefined the very meaning of power, one signal, one adaptation, one heartbeat at a time.